The fluorescent lights in his boardroom felt like an interrogation, and maybe that's exactly what it was. "Sit down, Vivian." Dominic Voss didn't look up from the folder on the glass table between us. His voice was the kind of quiet that made a room smaller. "We're not finished." My hand was already on the door handle. Cold brass, solid, real. I needed it to be real right then. How had I ended up here? 3 weeks ago I was Vivian Calloway, 28 years old, bartending double shifts at Archer's, a upscale steakhouse in downtown Toronto's financial district, clipping coupons at the Loblaws on King Street because my daughter Hazel's Ventolin prescription had just gone up again, and our provincial drug plan hadn't caught up yet. And now I was standing in a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor, being told I couldn't leave by a man whose net worth had its own Wikipedia entry. I should have called in sick the night he walked into Archer's, but Hazel's asthma had flared the week before. I'd already missed 2 shifts. Our landlord, Mr. Antonescu, had been very polite and very firm about the first of the month, and I had $300 in my checking account, and a 4-year-old who needed a functioning nebulizer. So I'd asked my neighbor Helen to stay with Hazel for a few hours, promised to bring back the good cheese from the restaurant's charcuterie board if there was any left, and I went to work. I remember exactly when the atmosphere changed. I was restocking the back bar, and the room just went quiet. Not completely, but the way a conversation drops when someone important walks in and everyone recalibrates. My manager, Glenn, materialized at my elbow. Table 12 just sat, Voss party. He straightened his already straight tie. He requested the full tasting menu. Take it. I'd heard of Dominic Voss the way everyone in Toronto had heard of him. Through headlines. Voss Capital. The waterfront development deal that had split city council for 2 years. The federal infrastructure contract. The profile in the Globe where he'd said, without apology, that sentiment had no place in boardrooms. He was 34, Estonian-Canadian, and had reportedly bought his first commercial property at 22. With money he'd made flipping distressed assets, while most people his age were maxing out their student lines of credit. What the profile didn't prepare me for was the physical fact of him. He sat alone at the corner table, 2 men in dark wool coats standing near the host stand. Sharp jaw, dark blonde hair cut close, eyes the color of the lake in November, that gray-green that looked calm on the surface and wasn't. His suit probably cost more than my monthly rent, which in Toronto meant it cost roughly as much as a small car. I approached. "Good evening. Welcome to Archer's." I was proud that my voice came out even. "Can I tell you about tonight's specials?" He looked up slowly. He had a way of shifting his attention that made you feel like a document being read. His eyes went to my face, then my name tag, then back. "Vivienne," he said. Not a question. Just my name in his mouth, like he was deciding whether to keep it. Nobody called me Vivienne except my mother when I was in trouble. "My name tag," said Viv. "What would you recommend?" he asked. I told him the sablefish. He ordered it without hesitation, then returned to the call he'd paused when I approached. I walked back to the bar, feeling his attention trail after me like a hand on my shoulder. He stayed until close. Every time I came to his table, to refill his sparkling water, to clear a course, he would stop mid-sentence and watch me the way you watch something you're trying to solve. The tips from his table alone that night covered Hazel's prescription and left enough for groceries. When I brought the bill, he handed me a black Amex without looking at it. Our fingers touched in the exchange. His hands were warm, and there was a small scar along the inside of his right wrist, the kind that looked old and deliberate. "You studied music," he said, as I was about to turn away. I froze. "Sorry? The way you move your hands when you explain a dish." His eyes were steady. "You're counting something." I had played piano through university before Hazel, before everything unraveled. I hadn't touched keys in 4 years. "I used to," I said carefully. He nodded once, like I'd confirmed something. "I'd like to hear that sometime." I found a $1,500 tip on a $300 bill. I tried to return it. I actually ran out to the parking garage where his car, an understated black Range Rover, was still running at the curb. His driver stepped forward before I got close. "Mr. Voss doesn't make errors," the man said, not unkindly. I stood there in the November cold with an envelope in my hand and no idea what had just happened to my life. 2 days later, a delivery arrived at my apartment. A Yamaha upright piano, movers who refused to take it back, and a card that said only, For whenever you're ready, no number, no last name. I knew who it was from, and the fact that he knew my address made my stomach drop straight to the floor. The day after that, Hazel's favorite kind of day, a Tuesday with no daycare, a box of children's books arrived. Bilingual picture books, French and English, the kind I'd always lingered over at the Pages bookstore on Bloor, before quietly putting them back. Hazel unpacked every single one onto the floor and arranged them by color. I donated the designer scarf that came the week after. I kept the books because they were already Hazel's. I shared the catered dinner delivery with Helen next door because there was enough osso buco for 6 people and I live in a 1-bedroom. I should have quit. Should have asked Glenn to keep me off his section. But Hazel's nebulizer needed replacing, and our building's heat had already failed twice that winter, and the tips from Dominic Voss's table were the first time in 2 years I'd felt like I wasn't one bad week away from asking my mother for money I knew she didn't have, so it continued. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, he would come to Archer's, always requesting my section, rarely speaking beyond the order, but his eyes followed me with a focus that felt like a hand at my throat. Not threatening exactly, more like attention used as possession. Then came the night in November when I nearly fainted mid-service. Hazel had been up 3 nights with a bad flare. I'd been awake with her, running the humidifier, measuring puffs, timing her breathing. I'd come to work on 4 hours of sleep and 3 coffees, and whatever adrenaline sheer necessity produces in a single parent. I was carrying a plate to a 4-top and the room tipped slightly, just slightly. But he saw it from across the room. His hand caught my elbow before I fully registered him moving. "When did you last sleep?" he said quietly. He was standing beside me like he'd always been there. "I'm fine." Mortification had woken me right up. "I just need some water." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he set cash on his own table, said something to Glenn that made Glenn nod immediately and not make eye contact with me, and guided me firmly toward the coat room. "You can't just," I started. "Your shift ended 4 minutes ago," he said. Glenn confirmed it. Outside, his Range Rover was at the curb. Every rational thought I had said, "Do not get in that car." But I was running on nothing, and he was holding the door, and I was tired in a way that lived in my actual bones. We drove mostly in silence through the wet streets of the financial district. He asked about Hazel, not intrusively, just, "Your daughter, how old?" And I told him 4 and he nodded and didn't push. When we pulled up to my building on Bathurst, I saw him, Marcus, Hazel's father, my ex, leaning against the front steps with his hands in his pockets, and the particular expression he wore when he needed something, and had decided charm was the fastest route. I hadn't seen Marcus in 7 months. The last time he'd asked me for $2,000 to cover a debt he'd described as temporary and was clearly not. I'd said no. He'd said things I hadn't repeated to anyone. "You know him," Dominic said. "Not a question. Hazel's father." My voice came out flat. "He'll want money." Something went very still in Dominic's face. He said something to his driver in Estonian, low and even. Then, "Wait here." I watched through the window as he crossed the sidewalk to Marcus. I couldn't hear anything, but I watched Marcus's face go from confident to pale to something I can only describe as chastened. And 2 minutes later, Marcus was walking quickly to his car without looking back. Dominic returned and opened my door. "He won't bother you again tonight," he said simply. That night, after he'd seen me to my door and looked briefly around my apartment with those November Lake eyes, and looked at Hazel asleep on Helen's lap on the couch, with an expression that shifted in a way I couldn't name, he paused in the doorway. "Get some sleep, sunshine," he said. Nobody had ever called me sunshine before. The word landed somewhere I wasn't prepared for. 3 days later, Marcus was found with a broken jaw and 2 cracked ribs in the parking structure behind a bar in Scarborough. Police said it looked like a debt dispute. I knew better. That same week, papers arrived by courier. Legal documents, Marcus's signature notarized, full transfer of sole custody of Hazel to me. A family lawyer I'd never spoken to sent a cover letter explaining everything had been handled. I should have run. Instead, I left a thank you note with Glenn at Archer's and told myself that was the end of it. The next evening, a phone was waiting in the coat room, new, still in the box. A sticky note said, "Pick up when you're ready." Dominic answered on the first ring. "Have dinner with me on Thursday," he said, and I said yes. Because I was in debt to my own sense of survival, and because I was drawn to him in a way I didn't trust and couldn't stop. That dinner led to 4 more. Always private rooms in restaurants I would never have been able to afford on my own. Canoe Alo, once a whole floor of a building near Yorkville that appeared to be his. Always his security somewhere nearby, never intrusive, always there. Controlled environments where he was the fixed point everything else organized itself around. I told myself I was doing this for Hazel, that the financial security was worth navigating whatever this was, that I understood what I was getting into. I was wrong, and now I was standing in his boardroom at 11 at night, photos spread across the glass table between us, and he was looking at me like I was something he was deciding whether to keep. "Sit down," he said again. Quieter this time. That was somehow worse. I sat. The folder he slid across the table held 3 photos. Me that afternoon, meeting Detective Andrea Pham at the Balzacs on Bay Street. Coffee 45 minutes, nothing that had felt like a crime. But in the photos it looked like a secret, and I understood immediately that to him, that's exactly what it was. "It's not what you think," I said. He stood in one motion and came around the table, stopping close. Not touching. Just the particular gravity of him, his presence filling up the room. He smelled like cedar and cold air, and something I'd never been able to name but always noticed. "Then explain it to me, Vivienne." The hurt underneath the quiet was what frightened me most. In the weeks I'd known him, I'd come to understand that beneath the precision and the control was a man whose entire architecture was built on loyalty. Or the absence of it, and in his eyes, I had just demonstrated the absence. Explain why the woman I've brought into my life was sitting with a police detective I know is working against me. "She came to me," I said. My voice was steadier than I expected. She said she had questions about Marcus, that I might be a person of interest in the assault investigation. A muscle in his jaw moved. "And you didn't think to tell me this?" I was scared. That was true. I was scared of what she'd said. I was scared of what he would do. I was scared of myself, of how far I'd already let this go without fully understanding what this was. "She told me you were dangerous," I continued. "She showed me files. She said she could help Hazel and me disappear. New identities, support, the whole thing." He turned away, paced once to the window and stood there, the city below him like something he owned, which in several specific and literal ways, parts of it he did. "Did you consider it?" he asked. I hesitated too long. He turned back and the look on his face made me keep talking. "For about 5 minutes," I said, "when she showed me the photos of the people who'd crossed you, what had happened to them." I made myself hold his gaze. "I'm not going to lie to you. I thought about it." The silence lasted long enough that I heard the HVAC system. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked finally. "Yes." He nodded slowly like this was the right answer. "Fear is honest. I can work with honest." He moved to the window wall, hands in his pockets, looking out. "What did Pham actually want from you?" "She wanted me to agree to wear a wire, to feed information about your business dealings. She said she had enough for obstruction charges if I didn't cooperate." I swallowed. I told her I had nothing to give her. "Did you mean it?" I stood up. My legs felt like badly made furniture, but I stood. "You sent someone after Marcus. You had him beaten badly enough that he signed away his daughter's custody from a hospital bed. I know that. I know what you're capable of." I held his gaze, and yes, I still meant it. He looked at me for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Why? I hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even fully admitted it to myself. But I was exhausted and frightened, and standing in a glass boardroom with this man who had upended my entire life, and the words came out like they'd been building pressure for weeks. "Because I'm yours," I said. "Whether that's smart or not. I'm yours and I think you know it." The room went completely still. "Say that again," he said, very quietly. "I'm yours and I don't know what to do with that." He crossed the room in 4 steps. His hand came up to my face, his thumb brushing the corner of my eye where, apparently, I had started crying without noticing. "You're right to be conflicted," he said, his voice low. "What I feel for you, it's not uncomplicated, Vivienne. I don't do things gently." He stepped back, moved to the bar cart along the wall, and poured 2 glasses of something amber without asking. 40-year Hibiki, he said, setting one in front of me. "If I wanted to compromise you, I'd have done it a month ago." I almost laughed. "Detective Pham is not operating on her own initiative," he said, sitting across from me now rather than looming over me, which somehow made the conversation feel possible. "She's a small piece of something larger. A task force that's been trying to build a case against my holding company for 3 years. They've never succeeded because I've been very careful about separation. He paused. They approached Marcus after his incident, offered to reduce any potential charges against him in exchange for information about me. Through you. The air went out of me. Marcus was working with them. He was considering it, which is partly why the conversation with Fam this afternoon concerned me so deeply. He met my eyes. They want you because they believe you are the one vulnerability I have that I haven't anticipated. I looked at my hands on the glass table. Am I? He was quiet for a moment. I didn't anticipate you, no. It wasn't a romantic line. It sounded like an admission that cost him something. I need you to understand what happened tonight, he continued. Fam reaching out to you, the timing of it, it's escalating, which means I need to know exactly where you stand. His voice was even, precise, not where you stood an hour ago now. I didn't tell her anything, I said. I told her I had a 4-year-old and no interest in going anywhere near a federal investigation, and I left. She'll come back. I know. He studied me. When she does, I need you to tell me immediately. He leaned forward slightly. Not after. Not when you've decided I can handle it. Immediately, Then I need the same from you, I said. I surprised myself with how steady it came out. If there's something I need to know to protect Hazel, I need you to tell me. Not after you've decided I can handle it. Immediately. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but in that direction. That's fair. I'm glad you think so, because I'm not asking. He leaned back. Looked at me like I was something he was recalculating. Fam offered you witness protection, and you said no. You came up here when I called you in, even knowing about the photos. You just told me you're mine. He paused. Why aren't you running? I picked up the hibiki glass, took a small sip. It tasted like time. Because Hazel called you Dom last week, and you read her a story about a caterpillar 3 times in a row, and you didn't look like a man who was performing. I set the glass down, and because I've been running for 4 years and I'm tired, something in him went very quiet. Not cold quiet, the other kind. What exactly are you offering? I asked. Not the protection, not the money. What are you actually offering me? He was silent for a long moment. Everything, he said. And I need you to understand that means the parts that aren't comfortable, too. He stood again, moved to the window. My father built Voss Capital on methods I spent my 20s trying to put distance between. He's not a man the business press would write about kindly if they knew everything. He turned. I've spent 8 years restructuring every aspect of the company's operations toward full legality. It's not finished. There are people who have interests in the old ways continuing, who are not happy about my direction. Is that why Fam's task force is interested now? I asked. Because you're transitioning and you look vulnerable? His eyes focused on me. Yes, you're good at that. I spent 2 years managing bar staff, I said. You learned to read a room. The almost smile again. I'm offering you a place beside me while I finish what I started. Not behind me, beside. He came back to the table. I know that's not a small thing to ask, especially with Hazel. Hazel is the entire question, I said. The rest of it, the money, the security, the complicated man with the complicated past, I can navigate that. But if at any point she is in danger, or if growing up around your world teaches her things I can't undo, then you leave, he said. I would not stop you. I looked at him, tried to find the performance in it. You would really let us go. It would be one of the harder things I've ever done, he said. But yes, I'm not interested in keeping you here by force. I want you here because you've chosen to be. He paused. Have you? I wasn't ready to say yes completely, but I was too honest to pretend I hadn't already made some version of the decision. I need to see Hazel, I said, and I need you to take me to her. He pressed a button on the phone at the end of the table. Bring the car around. In the elevator, riding down 42 floors, he stood beside me without speaking, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. His hand found mine somewhere between the 30th and 28th floors, and held it without making anything of it, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't pull away. His private residence was in a tower in the St. Lawrence neighborhood. Not the penthouse, just a high floor, understated from the outside, in a way that Toronto old money understood, and newer money hadn't learned yet. His housekeeper, a composed woman named Ingrid, had collected Hazel from Helen's place 2 hours ago with what sounded, From Hazel's subsequent enthusiastic report, like a very smooth cover story involving a playdate and hot chocolate. "Mama." Hazel's voice hit me from down the hallway before I even had my shoes off. She came pelting around a corner in her socks and launched herself at me with the full confidence of a child who has never once doubted her welcome in my arms. I held her for longer than I needed to, long enough that she started squirming. "Dom has fish," she announced when I finally set her down. "Real ones. A whole wall." "I see," I said. I looked up and found Dominic watching us from the hall. His expression was open in a way I'd never seen from him in any professional context, unguarded. "It was set up last week," Ingrid said quietly from behind me, with the precise timing of someone who understands that information can be a gift. Mr. Voss asked for it after the first time Hazel visited. She met my eyes briefly. He said she'd mentioned it in passing. Hazel had mentioned 6 days ago that her friend at daycare had a fish tank, and it was the best thing she had ever seen. She'd said it to me over dinner. Dominic had been there. He had remembered and acted on it within the week. I got Hazel ready for bed in a guest room that felt designed for exactly this purpose. A child's space done in soft greens and yellows, a bookshelf with titles I recognized, a nightlight shaped like the moon, too deliberate to be coincidental. "Were you scared?" I asked, tucking her in, "when Dom's people came to get you?" She considered this with the serious face she wore when answering important questions. "Ingrid brought peppermint hot chocolate," she said. "In a real mug, not a kid cup." I kissed her forehead. That was very grown-up of her. "Dom's going to teach me to play the fish song on the piano," Hazel added, her eyes already heavy. "He knows it from before." I stood in the doorway after she was asleep and let the full weight of the last several hours settle onto me. This child in a room prepared for her. This man in the hallway waiting for a conversation that would determine everything. In the living room, Dominic had opened wine. A Niagara Peninsula Pinot, I recognized as the kind of bottle that appeared on menus with no price listed, which in Toronto restaurants meant it was very expensive, or very good, or both. "Sit," he said, "please." The please was effortful for him. I found that I liked it. I sat. He remained standing at the window. The city below was doing what Toronto does at midnight in November, glittering imperviously. "Ingrid told you about the room," he said. "It wasn't an accusation." "She did. I should have told you myself." He turned. "I've been planning for this possibility longer than you've been planning for it. That's not fair." "It's not," I agreed. "It's also not entirely a surprise." He sat down then, not across from me but beside me, on the other end of the long couch, far enough to give me room to breathe. "I want to tell you something about why I work the way I work," he said. "And I want you to understand it's not a justification. It's context." I waited. "My mother left when I was 11. His voice was even. "Practiced even. The way you get when you've run a story through yourself enough times that the sharp edges have worn smooth. She and my father had a specific arrangement, and when the arrangement became inconvenient for her, she recalibrated. She went back to Tallinn, started a new family, sent cards at Christmas." He paused. My father responded by doubling down on every controlling instinct he already had. He built the business into something impressive and completely airless. Nothing moved without his knowledge. Nothing happened without his approval. A beat. I grew up watching what happens when loyalty fails, and someone decides control is the substitute. "You inherited the control," I said quietly. "I inherited all of it. I've spent a decade trying to determine which parts to keep." He looked at me. "What I haven't inherited is the part where people are assets. My father treated every relationship as a transaction. I don't know that I'm entirely free of that tendency, but I know I'm trying to be. What am I to you?" I asked, honestly. He was quiet for a moment. "You're the first person in 8 years who's looked at me across a table and argued with me," he said. "Not to impress me, not strategically, just because you thought I was wrong." He paused. "That first dinner, when I said something about the city's shelter funding gap and you pushed back, I went home and checked the numbers. You were right, I remembered. That dinner." I'd been braced for irritation. He'd just gone quiet and thoughtful and moved on. "And Hazel?" I asked. Something moved through his face. "Hazel reminds me of my sister." He said it simply, like he'd made the decision to tell me and was just executing it. "Lena. She was 8 years younger than me. She had this way of asking questions that made you feel like the question actually mattered." A pause. She died when I was 23. Brain tumor. It took about 8 months from diagnosis. I didn't say I'm sorry because it felt insufficient. That's why you read the caterpillar story 3 times, I said instead. Lena had a caterpillar phase. The ghost of something moved across his face. Hazel asked me to do the voice and I couldn't stop. We sat in the quiet of that for a moment. Tell me what you're actually offering, I said. Specifically, if I say yes to staying, to trying this, what does that look like? He turned to face me. You and Hazel move somewhere you actually want to live. Not here, this is too connected to my work. A house in the annex, Leslieville, wherever feels right. Hazel in a good school, the kind of stability you've been building toward for 4 years but with the financial weight taken off. He paused. You go back to music if you want to or not, that's entirely yours. I've already spoken to the dean of the Glenn Gould School on a purely hypothetical basis. Of course you have, I said. I told you I plan. And in exchange? Partnership, he said. That word means I tell you what's happening, that I don't make decisions about your life without consulting you, that I'm building something worth bringing you into, not asking you to manage the wreckage of what already exists. He met my eyes. And that when things are difficult, and they will be difficult, you tell me instead of meeting police detectives at coffee shops on Bay Street. That's a reasonable ask, I said. I thought so. I looked down at my hands. The wine was very good. Outside, the city went on being Toronto. Relentless, pragmatic, certain of its own importance. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth even if you think it'll make me leave. ASCAS. Detective Pham showed me a file. 3 names. Men who were business competitors of yours who are no longer operating. I met his eyes. Did you order that? He held my gaze without flinching. One of them, yes. He was planning to move against my company in a way that would have taken 20 people's livelihoods with it, and he had made it personal in a way that left no other resolution. He paused. The second was ordered by my father before I took over and carried out after. I didn't know until it was done. The third, Pham is overstating her evidence. He's alive and living in Kelowna. Can you stop? I asked. Not the business, the legitimization. I understand that takes time. But the other way of resolving things. Can you stop? He was quiet for a long moment. I have stopped. Largely. But I won't lie to you and tell you that if someone moved against you or Hazel, I would leave it to the courts. I had known that answer before I asked. That's honest, at least. You asked for honesty. I did. I set my wine down and thought about the list I would have made if I'd had time to make it. The reasons to take Hazel and go, accept Pham's offer, start over somewhere without a piano I hadn't asked for, and a fish tank built on a 4-year-old's passing comment, and a man whose control of everything around him included, apparently, me. The reasons were real and serious, and they mattered. But there was Hazel in a room down the hall, sleeping like she was home. And there was Dominic Voss, one of the most powerful men in Ontario, sitting on a couch beside me and telling me the truth about his dead sister and his controlling father, and the one man he'd ordered killed, and the one he hadn't, and the only thing I could hear underneath all of it was, I am trying to become someone worth keeping. A trial period, I said finally. Like you said, not a commitment to forever. We try this. I maintain my independence, my own bank account, my own decisions about my career and Hazel's life. You consult me before making any choices that affect us. Agreed. And if at any point I feel like we're being pulled into something I can't protect Hazel from, then you go, he said. I meant it. I know you did, I said. That's a significant part of why I'm still here. He looked at me for a moment. Then he reached over slowly, deliberately, and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was so simple and so careful that something in my chest came loose. May I? He said, quietly. I leaned forward and answered him. His kiss was nothing like I'd imagined, and I had imagined, more than I'd admitted to myself. It wasn't a demonstration of power. It was careful, unhurried, deeply attentive, like he was listening for something and had found it. When I finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, and his breathing wasn't entirely even. I've wanted to do that since the 3rd time you told me I was wrong about something, he said. You were wrong about the Scarborough Transit extension too, I said. Just so you know. He laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that surprised him, and I felt it change the room. We checked on Hazel together before I went to the guest room. Ingrid had quietly prepared. She was deeply asleep, one arm flung over the plush seal she'd named Gerald, the fish tank casting soft blue light across her face. "She's extraordinary," Dominic said from the doorway. "She really is," I agreed. He walked me to my room, said goodnight at the door with his hand briefly on my face, and something behind his eyes that looked like a man making a promise he intended to keep, and then he was gone down the hall. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet and thought about the woman I'd been 3 weeks ago, counting out coins for the Loblaws self-checkout and calculating which bills could wait another week. The woman who had been so tired of being exhausted that she'd gotten into a dangerous man's car, not entirely because she had no choice, but because some part of her had been ready to stop choosing the smaller life. I wasn't naive enough to think the next months would be smooth. There would be difficult nights and questions I didn't know how to answer, and threats that came from directions I couldn't anticipate. Dominic Voss was not a simple man in any sense of the word, and his world was not a safe one in the conventional sense. But Hazel was sleeping in a room that had been built around a single comment she'd made at dinner. And somewhere down this hall, a man who ran a 9-figure company had cried, almost barely, controlled it with visible effort, when I described the first time Hazel had sat down at the piano he'd sent us and picked out a melody by ear. There were worse foundations for a beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the wings of Walter Hall at the Royal Conservatory, and my hands were shaking. Not badly, not the way they'd shaken in Dominic's boardroom that November night. Just the honest nerves of someone who'd been away from performance for 5 years and was about to play in front of 300 people for the first time since before Hazel was born. Dominic found me in the hallway. He was in a charcoal suit, and he looked precisely the same as he always did, which was to say like someone who owned the situation, except for his eyes, which looked the way they always did when it was just us. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." I smoothed my dress. The green one, his choice for tonight, though he'd made the suggestion so carefully it had felt like my own. We were still negotiating the line between his instinct to manage and my instinct to resist it. We were both, I thought, getting better at it. "Hazel is in the 3rd row," he said. "She asked Ingrid to do her hair to match yours." I looked at him. "You're not helping with the nerves." "I'm not trying to," the corner of his mouth. "I'm trying to give you something to walk out there for." I kissed him once briefly and walked out onto the stage. The hall was full and warm, and the Steinway was perfectly tuned, and when I sat down and placed my hands on the keys, the 4 years of silence collapsed into a single breath, and then I was playing. Not for Dominic and not for the audience, but for the version of myself who had packed up her music in 2 bankers' boxes and put them in a storage unit on DuPont Street and told herself that chapter was done now. She wasn't done. Afterward, Hazel ran up the stage steps without asking permission and wrapped herself around my knees, and Dominic followed at the pace of a man who was trying to remember that not everything was his to manage, and when I stood up and took his hand, and my daughter's hand, the 3 of us standing in the lights of Walter Hall while people applauded, I thought, this is the thing I didn't know how to want. This exact, specific thing. He proposed 2 weeks later, at home on a regular Wednesday, with Hazel sitting between us on the kitchen floor, helping dismantle a cardboard box the grocery delivery had arrived in. He produced a ring from his jacket pocket without ceremony. Oval sapphire, plain gold band, not flashy, chosen. "I've been carrying that since January," Hazel said helpfully, looking up from her cardboard project. "Ingrid said I couldn't tell." "Hazel," Dominic said. The warning in his voice was entirely undermined by the fact that he was smiling. "She bribed me with the good fruit snacks," Hazel added, without apparent remorse. I looked at him. This man who had walked into my life with all his gravity and planning and careful attention, who had memorized the name of my daughter's daycare teacher, and the specific type of cheese I liked best from the charcuterie at Archer's, and the exact right way to give me space when I needed to think without making it feel like abandonment, who had slowly and deliberately, and with more patience than I'd expected from him, been teaching himself to hold things loosely instead of tight. "Yes," I said. He put the ring on my finger, and Hazel said, "Finally," with the authority of someone who had been managing this situation from the sidelines for quite some time, and Dominic laughed that surprised, helpless laugh again, the one that still felt like catching something rare. Later, after Hazel was in bed and the city outside was doing its November thing. It was always November with us, apparently, that cold and clarifying month. He held my hand in the kitchen and said, "I want to tell you something. Tell me." "I'm not finished becoming the person you deserve," he said. "I want you to know I know that." I leaned against his shoulder. "I'm not finished either," I said. "That's the point." Outside, Toronto carried on being Toronto. Inside, we were three people who had found each other by accident and stayed together on purpose. And that, I'd come to believe, was the truest kind of story.